Hello, everybody. Welcome to Strengthen Our Voices' first live virtual event. My name is Heidi Ellis. I'm the Director of Partnerships and Development here at Strengthen Our Voices. We're excited to have this conversation today. It's an important conversation to have given what's going on in our nation right now. We also want to honor Minority Mental Health Month and provide a space for healing while also dealing with what our nation is grappling with right now in terms of the fact that injustices are happening in both the Black and Brown community, but also in the LGBT community, and recognizing the intersections. So we're happy to have you here. Strengthen Our Voices is very much excited about doing work around empowering individuals while unpacking social structures and institutional racism, discrimination, and inequities that adversely impact mental health and the well-being of those that intersect within these communities. We thank you for donating tonight. All the proceeds will go to both our work in the House of Gigi, which was founded to provide education and empowerment for transgender people of color. It's a legendary house as well. And also to help strengthen our voices with doing deeper, better work as we enter this new school year, understanding that we're under a new normal. So we thank you for that. We'll be providing a link in the chat for you to make additional donations if you're able. We really appreciate that. Lastly, I'll just do some housekeeping before I turn it over to Bobby Donahoe, our president. We are recording, so just letting you know that. We're also streaming live on Facebook, hopefully, but if not, we will post the video afterwards. And I'll just let you know that we will also provide resources when we do post the video. The chat is open for discussion, but we ask that you do submit questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I will monitor that when we turn over to the Q&A section after Bobby does the moderated discussion. So besides that, I'll turn it over to Bobby Donahoe, our esteemed leader, founder of Strengthen Our Voices, to introduce Key Alexander, our guest, and tell you a little bit more about our organization. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Heidi, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending today. We're really happy to have you and extremely excited to be having this important conversation tonight. So really quickly, I wanted to just briefly introduce myself. My name is Bobby Donahoe. My pronouns are he, him, his. Originally from Richmond, Virginia, but live in DC now. And I'm a consultant by day, and in as my passion, for the last 6 years now, I've been president of Strengthen Our Voices, which was founded to, originally as our vision was to eliminate stigma surrounding mental health. Over time, our vision has evolved to enabling communities that embody mental wellness. So today's event is truly within the work that we do to bring resources, conversation, education, and dialogue into our day-to-day so that we're able to connect, grow, learn, and make a positive impact in our community. Our mission is to create environments of trust and support for those impacted by mental health issues through open dialogue, education, empowerment, and positive change. And much of what we do on a yearly basis is we deliver powerful and impactful strength-based suicide prevention and wellness programs to middle school and high school students. In addition to that, we host events to gather the community together, to fundraise, to donate, to deliver scholarships to students that are making a difference, and pull together resources, especially in this last year with COVID and virtual work, resources so that we are still serving the community to better themselves during this challenging time. SIOV is committed to empowering individuals while unpacking the social structures and risk factors like racism and inequality that impact mental health and well-being. Today's event is really designed to educate and empower our community. So we're going to be facilitating a discussion with Key, who I'll introduce in a moment, to encourage self-reflection and awareness. We'll encourage this throughout, but please don't hesitate to, or you're encouraged to put your questions in the Q&A. We'll be taking questions from the attendees today. We may not be able to answer all of them, but We hope that we'll be able to answer as many as we can given the time, because we are hoping to wrap this up around 8 because we know we're all busy and are on Zoom a lot. So Key, welcome. Just a quick intro and then I'll let you introduce yourself. Key is a scholar, educator, organizer, yoga teacher, consultant, doctoral student, and queer, trans, Black Puerto Rican. From my conversations with you thus far, someone who seemingly can do it all. I'm not going to take the thunder away from you. So I guess the first question I'll ask you is, tell us more about yourself. What do you do? Where are you from? And what drives your passion? Why we're here today?
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I first just want to say thank you so much to Bobby, to Heidi, and to all of SIOV for inviting me to be here with you all. I'm very excited. So my name is Key, like a key in the door, but I don't spell it that way because I'm fancy. And I'm currently based in Minneapolis, Minnesota on unceded Dakota land. And so I come to this work. I'm currently a doctoral student in education, curriculum, and instruction at the University of Minnesota with a focus on culture and teaching. And my passion is really kind of talking about social justice work, particularly how they impact queer and trans, Black and brown folks, and social justice issues, as well as like healing justice for our communities and our movement. And so I am a Midwesterner now by way of Philadelphia and the East Coast. And my communities that I am a part of, who my people are Black and brown, queer and trans communities, educators, scholars, abolitionists, healing justice practitioners, healers, thinkers and learners, and visionaries. And so I really see my work in the world as an educator, as somebody who is committed to helping people learn and grow and have transformative experiences. And how I got to healing justice was that when I was first coming up and doing a lot of organizing work, I was realizing that a lot of my community members, myself included, were really, really burnt out. And it was this constant process of working, and never really being able to kind of catch up. And I really thought that we had to do something different about that. And then I would go into these kind of healing spaces that ended up being largely white folks, mostly upper class, things that necessarily weren't really accessible to the folks that I was in community with. And so I felt this dissonance and I said, there has to be a middle ground. And so that's how I got into healing justice work. And I wanted to give a quick kind of definition of what I mean by healing justice. And this definition was given by the amazing Kara Page, who's a Black queer writer, healer, and my elder in the movement. Healing justice is a framework that identifies how we can holistically respond to and intervene on generational trauma and violence, and to bring collective practices that can impact and transform the consequences of oppression on our bodies, hearts, and minds. Through this framework, we continue to build political and philosophical convergences of healing inside of liberation movements and organizations. So it's really that sweet spot of prioritizing healing of trauma and generational trauma within our liberatory movement. So I'm really excited to talk more about it with you today.
Awesome. Thank you, Key. So I guess the first question I wanted to ask you was, from your perspective and based on your work, what does healing look like in our respective communities, specifically communities disproportionately impacted by injustice in this nation and sit at the intersections of racial oppression and LGBTQ plus discrimination?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. I think that healing looks a lot of different ways for different folks. I think one of the most amazing things about the framework of healing justice is that it encourages self-determination, right? We get to decide how we're healing. And so I think that can look a lot of different ways. Some of them more like kind of, I don't want to say simple, but kind of most accessible ways are building community with others, staying connected, building relationships. particularly around folks who share your identities, if you have marginalized identities, folks who have access to resources in that way. And then I think about some of the really body-based ways that we can do some healing. So for me personally, yoga has been a big part of my healing journey. I started practicing yoga about 8 years ago. And it was really when I was first coming out as a trans person and starting my transition, I was having not necessarily a bad time with my body, but I was struggling to be in my body and to be present with my body. And so yoga was a tool that helped me learn how to be in my body and kind of be present to all the things that come up in one's body rather than kind of checking out. So for me, yoga was a huge kind of healing modality. I also really like acupuncture, Reiki, massage. These are all modalities that often come from non-Western traditions, but have a legacy, particularly in liberatory communities and movements. Fun fact is that the Young Lords were and the Black Panthers were some of the first folks to bring community acupuncture to our country. And so it has always been used to support freedom fighters. And so I think those are some kind of like body work, physical ways that people can do healing. And then obviously, you know, there's talk therapy, somatic therapy, different types of ways to talk about your experience and know that trauma doesn't just live in our minds, but also in our bodies. So yeah.
Awesome. Those are a lot of things that many could benefit from. I guess the follow-up question I have is knowing that there is a particular ongoing need for healing, especially now, but for centuries. I'd love to hear more from you about what that experience is like, and then what do our communities need to feel safe?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think safety is like a really interesting kind of dynamic, right? Especially today. We're talking about safety in a lot of ways as we're having these kind of like larger political moments. And so I think safety ultimately for me are the ways that I can feel present and grounded in my own body and feel that I have like a freedom of movement, freedom to connect with others in ways that feel best for me. And so safety isn't necessarily guaranteed by an institution or a body of people, whether that be police, schools, hospitals. Those places don't necessarily guarantee safety for our communities. So I think our communities are the things that actually keep us safe. And so I think in these times when we've experienced a lot of collective trauma, what it can do is it can lead us to not trust, right? And building trust is, I think, essential to feeling safe. And so like when we're talking with young people, like they have to have adults in their life that they trust, that they can tell when they're having a hard time, when they're struggling, if they're being bullied or any type of issues, to have someone that you actually trust and feel like you can turn to can really, really make a difference. So I think developing cultures of trust in our communities, by knowing your neighbors, knowing the people that you're in physical proximity to, as well as like identity proximity to, actually building authentic relationships and asking each other, what do you need to feel safe? What can we do to support that? Because I think different communities need different things. And so I think specifically for Black and Brown folks, knowing that I think safety and being able to feel the whole expression of our emotions that we're feeling, especially now in this time. I think a lot of some of the rhetoric can be like, I want to listen to your platform, but if you could say it in this particular way, right? And I think part of feeling safe as a Black person for me is knowing that I can have my whole range of emotional experiences and that the people who want to be my allies and my accomplices are willing to hold that. And I think that can be really, really powerful. So yeah, I think building relationships is, I think, the foundation to what I think safety can look like for our community.
So you said something there that I wanted to kind of dig in with a little bit further. And it sounded like a lot of the things that you mentioned that would help you, like trans people of color feel safe, was things that they may not necessarily have right off in their own just straight up existence, right? So in your perspective, what are some of those like gaps or limitations that you feel like make it challenging to have these feelings of safety or these protective components into your life? I would love to hear more from you about those things that are more challenging.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think some of that is about, I think oftentimes we need to get our basic needs met, right? And I think trans people, particularly Black and brown trans people and Black trans women more specifically, are still in a place in our communities where we can't get our basic needs met, right? And so when you don't have your basic needs met, it's hard to kind of think about much other things. You're on survival mode, right? And so we want to bring our communities to a place where they're not just surviving, but they're thriving. So basic needs include housing, right? We're having a huge housing crisis, especially with COVID across the nation. I know that in Minneapolis currently, we're really dealing with trying to figure out how do we get affordable housing in our city, because we're really dealing with, we've had some encampments of folks that are trying to build communities because they are houseless right now, and trying to build communities safe in numbers, and are being targeted. And so housing is huge. Food and nutrition, right? Oftentimes folks are in communities that have food deserts, right? Places where there's no grocery stores, no fresh produce, anywhere in the vicinity that can be accessed by walking or public transportation. So I think food, what we put in our bodies, is equally important. I think, employment, access to being able to, be a functioning member of our society, right? And oftentimes trans people are still being excluded from getting jobs. And part of that is, now we have, we recently had that Supreme Court ruling that said you cannot be fired if you're like queer or trans. But I do think that it's important to kind of think about the ways that, we still can't even get in the door, right? So that's nice that people like are saying we can't be fired for those things, but if you never hire us, it doesn't really matter, right? And so I think a lot of times people don't think that they have the culture to support trans people. And I think, these things are learned. We can learn to create culture in new ways. So I think housing, food, employment, and and then for young people, access to education that isn't teaching them a history that erases them, right? So as a young Black trans person in school, I never really learned about my community's efforts, right? I didn't learn about Stonewall. I didn't learn that Black trans women were the people who started Stonewall. I didn't really learn about queer trans historical figures ever in school, right? And so without knowing that history, we don't know our potential. I always think it's important to know where you're going to go. You need to know where you came from. So I think those are all parts of basic needs that if Black and brown trans communities had, would be able to thrive in different ways.
Yeah, 100%. I thank you for that response. It's hard to hear, but it is a reality. But we talk about a lot with Strengthen Our Voices the importance of protective factors in your life, and for the trans Black community, there are very real barriers to those same protective factors. So that the community has to work that much harder to build that into their life, and that's important to know. So I just want to make sure that we're able to hear that, so that we could reflect on that for our own efforts to make sure that we're changing those around us. So the next question I have is, we often frame things in terms of marginalization when addressing issues of intersectionality. In your experience, what does it mean to you to identify as a trans person of color, specifically Afro-Latin, Latino, and occupying the space that you do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think sometimes when we talk about trans people, we talk about all the barriers to being trans. And there are some also really, really great things about being trans. And so for me, I think, I think that my identity as a Black person is deeply connected to my gender, and vice versa. I think they inform each other. For me, I think I have experienced the most joy I've ever felt when I'm in a space with other Black and brown, queer, and trans people. part of that is like the amazing culture that we've developed as a community. You know, whether that be from, you know, ballroom culture and gatherings and things like that, or whether it just be, you know, people being able to see each other in a way that feels like we don't have to explain our existence is absolutely heartwarming and freeing. And so I think also for me, it's given me an embodied understanding of the binaries that show up in the world, right? Like our society is shaped on this idea that, you know, it's either right or wrong, one or the other. And that's really not how the world works in a lot of other ways. There are so many other nuanced ways of seeing the world. And as a trans person, someone who's lived in this kind of path of having two very different experiences in the same body, in the same lifetime, it makes me see things really, really differently. It makes me see past the binary, see what's behind the binary. And I think that living as a trans person has allowed me to develop that lens in a way that if I didn't have that experience, I don't know that I would have. I think it also teaches me about expansiveness. I think for me, being trans is not the opposite of being cisgender. It's about being something else entirely. And so I think it's been a way to radically like reclaim the function of gender in my own life. It's been a way to, you know, learn more about myself. I think that I noticed that the things that scare me the most about myself are the most expansive parts of myself, are the places that scare me the most, but it's also the place that gives me the most freedom. And so I think that's really been a huge thing. And I've just, as a person who's, you know, Black and Puerto Rican, trans, queer, like I have lots of multiple identities at once. And so that's really just taught me to have a lot of compassion for other folks' experiences. It's taught me to see duality when it shows up, and to see possibility in places that folks might see as kind of closed off. So those are all the like wonderful things that I've learned about being trans, and we're just magical and fabulous. So there's that too.
I'm so glad we asked that question, because I feel myself like bubbling up with joy hearing you talk about that. So I can't help but put a smile on my face. I'm almost bummed about the next question, but it's equally as important, I think. We should always celebrate the things we love about ourselves. But the next question I wanted to ask was, can you share any misconceptions about the trans community, and specifically trans people of color, either that you've experienced or that you've learned through or written about in your work and research?
Mm-hmm. So I think for me, when I was coming up, when I was first coming out and sharing with my family that I was trans, a big thing that came up was kind of saying like, oh, I don't know any other people like us who are trans, right? So it was basically, you know, people thought that it was like a white thing. It was something that only white folks did, right? And so for me, that was just like this assumption that we didn't exist. And so I think that is a huge thing. I think also now there's this kind of perception that we only know about trans folks of color, particularly Black trans women, when they die, right? And so there's like these misconceptions that we all kind of live the same lives, and that, you know, that our stories are not worth telling until we're not here anymore. And so I think that's a huge misconception, because I think there are trans people doing amazing things in this world, but we don't get to hear about those things. I think the other, another misconception is also just that trans people like hate our bodies, or, you know, that all trans people like experience dysphoria in a particular way. And I personally didn't necessarily feel dysphoria around my own body. I mostly felt dysphoria about the way that other people treated me because of my body, right? And so it was never that I didn't like it. I just was having a hard time because other people were perceiving me and interacting with me as such in a way that didn't feel authentic to myself. So I think that that's a huge misconception, that trans people kind of like hate their bodies or hate their former selves and want to have anything to do. And the other thing, a big misconception is that trans people are not a monolith, right? And so I think often we think there is a trans experience when really there are lots of trans experiences and trans communities, right? I also don't think that we have one community. So I think that is a larger misconception. And I think that, you know, a lot of people don't think that they know any trans people. And you probably do know trans people. You just don't know that they're trans, right? And so I think sometimes we think that all trans people live their lives in the same way, but they don't. Some people live what we refer to as stealth, whereas, you know, people that they work with or go to school with don't know that they're trans, and everybody has the right to self-disclose in the way that works for them. So, you know, you probably have met a trans person in your life before. Maybe you just didn't know, but there's a perception that, you know, we're a really small community, but we're actually really large. Technically, we're 1% of the American population, but I think that's also like, we haven't figured out a way to accurately kind of get that data, right? And so I've done some research on that, particularly around research when it comes to higher ed institutions, like collecting data on like student culture surveys, or I forget what there's a specific name for them, but this kind of idea of trying to capture that data, but even the questions we ask to try to see if people are trans are in this binary way. And so we have a lot of work to do to figure out how do we actually collect that data to figure out how many trans people are. Trans is a huge umbrella. So just know that there's lots of different manifestations of being a trans person. There's no right or wrong way to be trans.
Yeah, great. I appreciate that. The one thing that this is again like another curveball. I didn't plan on asking this question, but your response inspired me. Because in doing a lot of my own learning over the last couple of years, even as a member of the queer community, I realized that something that I need to be more intentional about are the words that I use and the pronouns that I use, both to refer to myself and to others. And the note you just mentioned about how a lot of trans people live in stealth, and that you likely know someone, you know, to me makes it even more important that even if we don't know someone is trans, that we're using pronouns that are inclusive. What are your thoughts on that? Like, how do you react to or like to talk about diction and word use?
That's a great question. So there's like this, you know, there are these debates now about like, when we do opening circles, should we ask people their pronouns, you know, things like that. This debate on whether are we outing people by asking people pronouns. And I always think it's important to like think about the context, right? And so if we only ask trans people their pronouns, then yes, we create a dynamic where we're putting trans people on the spot, right? But I make it's a personal practice of mine as an educator, is that I always ask, when I first start working with a group, I always ask people what their pronouns are. And I say, pronouns are what you like to be called when I'm not using your name. So how do you like to be referred to if I'm not calling you by your name? Is really important. And I'm not going to assume how to refer to you outside of your name if I just met you, because I don't know you, right? And so I always say that like it's important for people to self-determine. And so by asking everybody in the space, not just people that we think might be trans, but asking everybody to share how they want to be referred to and not using their name, creates a culture of not assumption, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to ask people when I'm first meeting them what their pronouns are, rather than just assuming based on how they look that it would be okay to refer to them as that, right? I also think that there are ways that we can take out gendered language when we're talking about people. So this comes up when I teach yoga a lot. If I'm working with a group of students and I might want to say, like, have a person come and demo, I can, if I don't know their pronouns, I can model by stopping and just being like, hey, what are the pronouns you use? Great, before I continue on, right? The other thing I can do is say, you know, I asked this person, right? That's a way to like be gender neutral. I'm not gendering the person when I refer to that person over there. This person is a way to kind of talk about or refer to somebody without gendering the language at all. Sometimes people like to use they, them pronouns as a default, And I think that's okay generally, but I also think that like we should be mindful of when people offer their pronouns, right? Because sometimes people say, okay, so I don't gender anybody, I'm going to use they, them pronouns for everybody, but not all, like lots of trans people don't use they, them pronouns, right? Some trans people do, I do, some people don't, right? And so it's also misgendering if we kind of use they, them pronouns for everybody if they've told us that they use binary pronouns, right? So I think it's always just important to ask and not assume. And then when you mess up, you know, say, I'm sorry, correct yourself and keep it pushing, right? I think oftentimes people kind of make it about themselves or like, I'm so sorry, or I didn't know, or blah, blah, blah. And it's okay to mess up. You just have to kind of gracefully take the feedback and keep going. And that's how we model for other people to also work on that. So yeah, I think that there are ways that we can be inclusive of language in a lot of different ways, and it never hurts to ask. And also just be mindful that you're asking everybody and not just people that you think are trans. Because I think sometimes people are like, oh, you're only asking my pronouns because maybe I'm not passing today or something like that. And if I'm like, no, I actually have a culture of asking everybody's pronouns no matter how they present, that creates a different kind of culture.
100%. So in hearing you mention the whole concept of having the grace and the humbleness to admit I messed up, move on, not make it like a big deal of it, but just accept the feedback and really just say maybe that was a blind spot. Thank you very much. You know what I mean? I think that's a sign of a good ally in a way, right? I mean, you don't have to be perfect, but the fact that you're there and you're listening and you're willing to admit when you got something wrong. What other ways, what other things demonstrate great allyship? And then the second part to that question is, how does allyship contribute to healing justice as well?
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So I am in the camp of, I really like accomplices, right? I really want folks to feel like they have agency in doing the work and being alongside of folks rather than kind of being an outsider looking in, right? And so that means for me about being willing to be led by the folks that you are trying to be in allyship with, right? Or an accomplice with. So I think oftentimes people, they're like, I have good intentions and I want to help people, and here I'm going to go, I decide how I help other people, right? And I think there's difference between like measuring your own capacity, right? Because you should always be doing things within your own capacity, right? We want to honor that different people have different limits and different things to offer at different times. And it is really important that people are clear about what they can offer and when, right? And so it's not necessarily about capacity, but it is about what might feel like might be helpful for what you think might be helpful, or what is a value to you might not actually be a value or a priority to the community that you're trying to support, right? So being willing to be led by the folks that are in marginalized communities, I think are huge, right? So I think part of, and also like being led, but taking initiative, right? So I think the flip side of that is that kind of people take it to extremes. When they're like, cool, I want to be led by Black and brown people, and then they're sitting on their hands waiting for Black and brown people to direct everything that they do. And so there has to be a middle ground, like, right? You want to be able to take the initiative to do what you can, to talk to other people in your community about being an accomplice to a different community. I feel like that's work that is really underestimated. I would rather you talk to your racist uncle than I would have you come out to my community and tell me what to do. Right. And so I think that's part of the work that I think people don't feel is like actionable enough, but it actually has a huge, huge impact on changing our culture and changing our ideology, or just talking to people. Because I think that, when I hear, folks say things about trans people that are based in misconceptions, to me, the first thing comes up is, you obviously don't know any trans people. Right? Like if you knew some actual real life trans people, you might think about this differently, right? And which goes back to the point I made about like a lot of people think that they don't know trans people. And if you actually got to engage with trans people, you might think about that differently. And so I think that, yeah, like being willing to do your own work, do research. There's plenty of books by Black and brown scholars, like queer and trans scholars, about our communities and the things that we're fighting for and the things that we need. And so doing that own research, and then also willing to be led and collected. So it's kind of a both and, finding that sweet middle ground.
Awesome.
Oh
Thank
wait,
you,
I didn't answer
Oh.
the healing justice part. Sorry. Yeah. I think that that is a huge part too, because for me, I think if we're talking about a system in our country of, you know, white supremacy, patriarchy, homophobia, cissexism, right? All these things, there has to be, these are systems of power, right? And systems of control and domination. And part of that undoing in our cultural work is healing from that, right? If our ancestors, if you're part of a group of your ancestors participated in those systems of power in ways that you're not proud of or you don't feel good about, there's some healing to do amongst your own lineage, right? And I think right now is a really important time for cis people, white folks, you know, able-bodied folks, people with wealth, all those folks who hold privilege in these different areas, to recognize that there's some healing to be done around our past and around our communities to actually be an accomplice to Black and brown communities. So I think, you know, working with your own ancestors, you know, being able to think about the ways that these power systems of oppression have benefited you or harmed you, because, you know, men also, you know, patriarchy also hurts men, white supremacy also hurts white folks, you know, like there are all these things. Sexism also hurts cis people. So if we do some healing around that, I think that also moves us closer to being an accomplice.
Fantastic. So I am going to actually pull up one of the Q&A questions, because I feel like we're at a good spot in the questions where this question fits in. So this question comes from an ally that I have known for a while. And the question is, hi Key, I'm an administrator at a high school in Virginia. I want to ensure every student feels connected to our community and has a trusted adult that they can connect with. What can I do more of to create an environment where everyone feels more connected?
Awesome, that's a great question. I think that one thing is modeling, right? Working with young people, modeling is a huge tool. So you enacting the ways that you would like to see young people show up in your space, right? And so if you ask people what their pronouns are when you're first meeting people, if you're saying this is a space that includes everybody, if you're modeling those things, that kind of indirectly shows folks that you could be a trustworthy person, right? I know for a lot of high school teachers, middle school teachers, there's this kind of, sometimes folks have these safe zone stickers that sometimes are triangles or rainbows or things like that, that kind of you can place on your door and you say, this classroom is a safe space. And I know that a lot of schools have used that, where kind of teachers can put that on their door. And so it's kind of like an open door policy for LGBT young people to say, okay, I see this sticker on this teacher's door. They're a person that I could talk to about this. That's like a really visible way. And I think that, you know, intervening when, I think when folks are doing things that can be harmful, I think has a huge, huge impact, right? So if someone's using language that can be harmful to other people, intervening in the moment and showing like, that's not language that we use here, that's unacceptable here, we're a community where we support people, like that feels important. I think a lot of times young people feel like they can't go to an adult because when something happened and an adult was present, they didn't do anything about it. So if they go back to an adult later, they think, oh, I'm just causing more trouble than anything, right? And so intervening, I think, can be really, really helpful. And then, you know, just making spaces for folks to gather and connect. So if you have a GSA, you know, when I was younger, they were gay straight alliances, but now they're gender and sexuality alliances, which I think is really amazing. And, you know, but like if an after school club or something like that, like giving people the opportunity to build community with other people, I think is really important. And having people share stories, I think that is a huge part. Oftentimes in classrooms, if we don't get to know the other people that we're in class with, it can sometimes shape the way that we perceive the information that's coming, right? If I don't know anything about my classmate and they say something that, that might be a little problematic, because I don't know anything about them, I might not know the context in which they're coming from. I might not know, what they're dealing with that made them think that way. And so like when students get to actually share their stories and get to know each other on a level beyond just sitting in a classroom together, they are able to build compassion for each other and camaraderie, and are able to talk across difference in a different way when they feel like they're being heard and understood.
Awesome. Another question. It comes from another individual with which we've worked for a while. And the question is, I'd be happy to hear more dialogue around the most inclusive language to refer to BIPOC, specifically reflecting on the change in awareness of African American not necessarily being inclusive. I heard you mention Black and Brown people in this space. Wondering the best way to be an ally from this language specifically.
Amazing question. Thanks so much for asking it. Yes, so BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And so I think like when I'm talking about my community specifically as someone who's both Black and Latinx, like when I'm thinking about those folks, I try to get really specific. So when I say Black and Brown, those are the folks that I'm thinking about, right? I also think about Indigenous folks in that group of folks. Many Latinx folks are also Indigenous. And I also think that Black people are Indigenous, so that's a deeper conversation. But I do think that this language, to get really, really specific about, so when I moved to the Midwest, I realized that, particularly in Minneapolis, we have a very, very large Indigenous community. We actually have the largest urban, Indigenous community in an urban space in the country, right? And so that was much different than when I lived in Philadelphia, which, I've always known the land that I was on. Philadelphia is Lenape land, but I didn't get to interface with Indigenous communities the ways that I get to here. And so when I moved here, I noticed that people were very intentional about using BIPOC, right? Understanding that Black folks and Indigenous folks have different experiences than other people of color, meaning Latinx folks, Asian Pacific Islander folks, Middle Eastern folks, South Asian folks, right? And so kind of pulling out the way that anti-Blackness shows up in our society, as well as kind of like a pushback around indigeneity. Indigenous people are still here. This is their land. They will continue to be here. And so kind of pulling out that those experiences are different than other people of color has been really important. And so when I write about things, I definitely use BIPOC to talk about those broader communities. And then when I'm talking about my own communities, I often refer to Black and Brown folks because those are specifically the folks that I'm talking to. Same thing when I talk about like folks in the queer community, I often meaning queer and trans folks, in which LGBT folks are definitely fit under, but not everybody in the LGBT umbrella identifies as queer and trans. But when I'm talking, I'm specific about those communities. I saw there was a comment earlier about like bi-erasure, which I think is huge too. Like I think part of that for me, I use queerness as like a very expansive word that includes bi folks, pan folks, gay and lesbian folks, lots of different things, but with like a political tinge to it, which is why I prefer the word queer. And so I just try to get really specific with my language. I think sometimes we kind of generalize to catch all, but it's not useful to say Black and Brown folks if you're not actually talking about Black folks. If you say POC, but you're really only talking about Asian folks, I think it's important to be specific because not all people of color have the same experiences. So yeah, specificity I think is the helpful tool there.
Awesome, thank you, Key. So the next question I have, and then I have a fantastic question that was asked to follow it. It's like the group today knows where we're going. is I would love to hear your thoughts around your thoughts and feelings around representation for the trans POC community, and then how you navigate visibility with transparency and privacy at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so great question. Very loaded, right? So I think some of that is about representation is important, right? I think part of it is you don't know that you can aspire to something if you've never seen it before. So I remember when I met a trans person for the first time, and I was like, right? I was like, I didn't know that I could be trans. I didn't know any trans people growing up. I barely knew any like gay or lesbian people growing up. So for me, until I saw a trans person, I didn't know that it was possible, right? And so I do think that representation is important to see yourself reflected, but I also don't think that representation is enough, right? I think part of that is that, you know, people get to self-determine. So we kind of talked about being stealth before. And I think when I was younger, when I was coming out in Philadelphia, I met a lot of Black trans men who lived as stealth. And when I was younger, I would get really upset about it. I'd kind of be like, well, if you weren't out, people can't get their resources and the needs, and people were out and living out loud. And that's the only reason you've been able to get these access to things for your transition in the first place. So like, we all have to be like out and proud. But I realized that like, as I got older, that's not everybody's work, right? Now, some people just want to live their lives and they're entitled to do that, right? And so I think that part of this idea is that like, for trans people to be expected, we have to be respected, we have to be a spectacle, right? Like everybody needs to know all the things about our lives to then determine if we're legitimate enough for them. And trans people you're not entitled to trans people disclosing their trans status, right? And I think part of that is, just like being mindful of like the stigmas that come around that, people not understanding, and people have different choices and experiences as to why they share whether they're trans or not. And it's not fair to assume that people have the same reason for sharing or being out that other people do, because everybody is different, has different experiences. So I do think that representation is important, but it can't be the only thing, and it can't be that we have to be out in a particular way to be accepted. I think that there's also like an assimilation part, is that I remember that like when marriage equality kind of passed, part of that rhetoric was about to say like, look, we're just like straight people, and I'm always like, I'm not like you on purpose. That's very intentional. And that's okay. Like difference is actually okay. And I think we have a culture of sameness, right? But really like our diversity is what makes us such a dynamic place and a dynamic community. So I think that while representation is important, it's not the only thing. And we have to, like be respectful of the ways that people choose to live their lives.
So the follow-up question to that, which is a question provided by someone in the group today, which was, just curious, do you have any thoughts about the Pose Emmy snub and general representation of the trans community in pop culture, politics, etc.?
Harumph.
Triggered.
Yeah, I'm just like, yeah, I have a lot of feelings about it. I'm not surprised, which is like the sad part, is that like we've seen this happen all over again. India Moore, who is one of the stars of Pose, they said this, they said, like, why are we trying to, like, white cis folks created this kind of container to celebrate themselves, and like, why are we looking to be celebrated in this container that was not meant for us in the first place? And I think that's really, really real, right? I think part of it is that, like trans folks of color have such an amazing culture, and Pose is just one of the small fraction that kind of talks about our history. It's such an expansive history, and I love Pose, and also Pose has its limits, right? there's this thing that favors light skinned Black trans people in pose over dark skinned folks, right? Like, spoiler for the last season if you haven't seen, but like what happens to Candy is definitely connected to her being a dark skinned person, right? And so there are limits even within this amazing show that is, written and by trans people for trans people, and other queer folks in the community. And I was really disappointed to hear, well, like last year there's a clip going around of Billy Porter. Folks asked, when he won an award last year, folks asked like, oh, like, how do you feel about you getting recognized and another women getting recognized? And he had a very problematic answer where he was like, I don't live in the bittersweet. I think, it's important that we're in the building, and, they'll get their shine when it comes next. And the next year comes and they got snubbed, right? And so I think part of that is cis people being like, oh, it's good enough to be in the building. And it's like, you actually don't get to decide what is success for trans people, even if you're a member of the community, right? And I also think that there's particular like trans misogyny, which is, specific misogyny targeted towards trans women and trans feminine people, is something that exists in gay and lesbian communities, right? And so this idea that trans women are not seen for their work and their art and things like that is not a coincidence. Like, trans misogyny is built into our culture. So I think it's really important that we recognize that, that trans women often don't get to tell their stories. And when we do, we also have to celebrate their stories, but also know that the success of those stories are not contingent on whether white, straight, cis people think it's relevant enough to watch on TV. That show is like, if they find it and they feel educated by it, awesome, but that show is really for our communities, and we all know that it's a success.
And that is a message that I feel like every person should hear, every trans person should hear. That is powerful. So thank you for that answer. It's fantastic. So just a couple more questions. I'm gonna do another question from the Q&A. Are there specific or different asks you have for Black cis people who are working to be in better solidarity with Black gender expansive people?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking it. I think that something that's like really, really important is, we're hearing this rhetoric around, when we say Black Lives Matter, we mean that all Black lives matter, right? I'm including queer and trans Black lives. And so I do think it's really important for cis Black folks to kind of do that legwork around talking to community members about trans people, about gender expansive people, because I think that that's like very powerful work, right? I think we're often misunderstood in our own communities, right? And that is not, that's not the same to say that, I think people kind of twist that and say that like, oh, Black and brown communities are more homophobic or transphobic than white communities, which I don't think is true. It's not true. I think the reality is that most Black and brown, queer and trans people live in their communities with other Black and brown people. Like, that has always been the case. Whereas in like white, queer and trans folks have often left their communities and kind of established community in a different way. And that's not to say I'm a person who left my community, right? And so that's not to say that that's like unique to, your racial identity. But I do think that Black and brown people continue to be in their communities, even if their communities don't always understand them or don't talk about them explicitly, right? I think there are ways that just like people may not know that they know Black trans people, we also know like queer people in our communities that, we don't outwardly say, oh, that person is gay, but we might say, oh, the choir director is a little funny, or, like this person, that person's a little special, right? Like, there's this avoidance language around queer people that I think is important for like cis folks to kind of take head on, and kind of talk about Black trans people, Black queer people to other people in their communities, so that like that same way we kind of like get of understanding, get stories shared, get experiences shared, right? I think, again, a lot of people just don't know trans people personally, and so they make assumptions about what they see in the media. And so to have real conversations with folks, I think can be really powerful, and never underestimate the work that you do with a loved one, because I think ultimately liberation work is about changing hearts and minds, and you do that through trust, right? And so like your loved ones are the people that can be the most impactful work, because they already trust you, and you can really make a difference in a way that a webinar or a stranger or something like that can't have the same impact.
Fantastic. So we have 2 more questions for you, and we're about 5 till 8, so we are right on time. The first question is, are there any, I know you mentioned a lot of things that you do to bring you strength and to keep you, that are your needs. But I wanted to ask if there were any like particular methods or resources that you've used that were helpful or that you wish were more readily available for your community.
Do me a favor, repeat that question again. Sorry.
No worries. Are there any particular methods or resources that you've used or that you wish were more readily available to the community?
Yeah, I think therapy. Like I'm a huge person for therapy, and I think that a lot of times, particularly Black and Brown trans folks, often, are afraid to go to a therapist because they're afraid of being judged, afraid of not having a therapist that understands their cultural concerns, things like that. And so I think being able to find competent, like not just like trans competent, but trans affirming therapists are like very, very important. And so people kind of doing the work who do that kind of mental health and wellness work to really gather resources on learning about trans people and trans experiences, and learn that from people who have those experiences. I know lots of trans people who are therapists. I know lots of people who've done written work about those things. Turn to people in community to see how you can better support other folks in the community. I think sometimes we see resources that come from folks in marginalized positions be uplifted more, right? So for example, like a recent example is, all this call for anti-racist work, and Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, like skyrocketed on the bestsellers list. But all that did was resulting in uplifting this white person and talking about anti-racism, when there are lots of Black and Brown folks who have written books and dedicated their entire careers to anti-racism that got overlooked, right? And so kind of going back to the community for those resources. I also think that, making healing resources available to people. So oftentimes when people think about healing, there's some implication that things are broken. And I never think about healing as a nonlinear process, and it is something that you never complete. I don't believe that someone is just healed, right? Like we're always growing, we're always transforming, and we're always healing. And so like kind of doing the work to explain what healing is and how we can support each other through it, I think helps people demystify some of the other healing modalities that I mentioned earlier, be it yoga, Reiki, acupuncture, craniosacral, all those kinds of things. So I know for me, when I teach yoga, especially with young people, I try to ask them about, what do you think yoga is? What do you think yoga isn't? Like, let's talk about that. Let's create this space together. So I think that's a great resource. And something that I've done in my community to bring healing resources together is to do a healing salon, which I encourage people to do in their communities, where a group of friends and I got a bunch of body workers in our community to donate their time to basically kind of have a couple hours in the afternoon where they donate the time to like see people in a community-based setting. And so we use it as a fundraiser where people donate their time and then people pay sliding scale for the services, whatever money we make. We put that, the first one that I was a part of in Philadelphia, when Ferguson happened, we collected all that money through that healing salon to send to the bail fund. And so I've been a part of those kinds of things. And that's a really great way for people in community who might not know about different types of body work and healing modalities to come get a taste it'll be a little bit cheaper than if someone was going to see someone in a private practice, and kind of gets everybody kind of gets the community gets some resources, people get information, and practitioners get to make connections with community members.
Fantastic. So the last question I have for you is, we talked about a lot of questions that might be educational today, that might provided your amazing perspective that we all can learn from. But is there any message or anything you'd like to say for those that may be listening who happen to be trans people of color?
Well, first, I always like to say that I love you. I love my trans kin, and it is an honor and a gift to love and be loved by other trans people. So I always say that. I know that there are so many trans people who don't have the privilege of being in community with other trans people. And that's something that I'm grateful enough to have. And so, yeah, I think it's always stay strong, know that it's okay to not be okay. And our communities are hurting right now. And so I think so much of be seen as legitimate, we kind of have to like tough it up and keep going through. And I think it's okay to be sad right now. I think it's okay to sit with everything that's happening. We've had a number of trans folks be murdered this year alone, and that is, it keeps happening. It's more trauma that's recycled. And so I think it's so important for us to recognize that our lives are valuable, as they matter when we're living them, and that we're important, and that we're special, and that we have a lot to offer the world, and to know that I see you, I hear you, and I'm proud to be in support of you in whatever you're doing in the world, because your life matters and it's valuable. And so I'm really, really grateful to be in community with other trans people, and hope that we can continue to make connections across this country to stay together so we can thrive.
And we echo that thought as well. We love our trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color family and community, our queer communities. And, us here at SIOV, we are grateful to have you here today. We are honored to have you here today, to be able to have a conversation that I hope will, impact someone's life, educate, and maybe empower those around us to, share the message and take that opportunity to do more research themselves. We at Strengthen Our Voices believe that we should be, actively seeking the ways that we can better our own mental well-being and health, and better those around us. So to all of you listening today, thank you for coming, and thank you for your questions. We've put a link to the donation portal in again. So if you can donate or support in any way, again, that goes to support our work this year, as well as the House of Gigi. And if you are interested in resources, we'll be packaging up some resources that Key helped us put together. And we'll send that out after the event. So thank you so much. And thank you, Key. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, SIOV team, for putting together today's event and for sharing.
Thank you, Keith. Thank
you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for coming. Take good care. Be well.
Back at you, Key. Good night.